Hi there, I'm Tim Rankin-Mills from TDC, and today I'm going to walk you through how we can automate SAP using Tricentis Tosca. We're going to have a look at three different ways of automating SAP. To start with, we're going to look at process driven, where each transaction in a chain of transactions in the order to cash process, as an example, are independent test cases within an overall process. In our toolkit, we have created the transactions as reusable test step blocks, categorized under their different functional areas. So to start off with, we're going to kick off with a login to SAP step or test case. So if we expand that out and have a look at the options that are in there, we can see we're logging into SAP itself, and then we need to select the instance that we want or the connection that we want, and then we need to go through and specify the login credentials. You select the username, select the password, and that's this first test case complete. Not much to it, simply logging on. Now we can choose to execute that test case in our Scratchbook, which is the area that we use for testing our automation as we're in the process of putting it together. We'll use the execution list later on. So there we can see we've hit the login screen, and now we're at the main menu within SAP. If we have a look back in Tosca, we can see those three steps that ran, little ticks on each particular action we took within the system. Okay, so that's the first step complete. Okay, so having completed the login, now we want to go and find the order transaction we're after. So we're going to use a VA01 here to create our sales order. We drag that and drop that as we did previously, and now we now have a second test case in our folder. So within there we can see we're entering the transaction code. We have space for entering all the initial order screen details, main details of the order itself, the materials that we want to include within this order, and then we save the transaction, and then we finish off by verifying that the transaction has created successfully and extracting out the order number from that code in the bottom left hand corner of the screen. Okay, so now what we actually need to do is provide the data that we want to use as an input here. So I'll hide the steps where we're not doing anything and just focus in on those where we're being prompted to enter some values. Now, in this case here, we've entered certain values into the system already, so we can select them from drop-downs. That's just clicking the enter button. Select a sold to party from the list. Just close those steps up a bit. And now we go through to the actual item table, and here we'll enter the material we're after. Obviously no drop down for this because there's too many materials in the system. The quantity we want, and that's us finished entering the information. So then we go and confirm and save the transaction. Okay, and again we can run this one in our Scratchbook as we did previously. So SAP already launched in the background, so we'll be starting off here by entering the transaction code to take us to the sales order. Entered all those details on the screen. We're now into the items table. We entered the material number and the quantity, and in the bottom right hand corner, once we save this, we'll see we get a green verification message, and the processing is finished. Back in Tosca, again we can see all of those steps entered green as we expected them to, and if we focus in on the verification steps, we can see that it was successful, and we extracted the order number out of there, which is now saved as a buffer called order number. Okay, back to our toolkit, and now we'll go to the shipping section, and we will get the transaction required for creating a delivery note. Same details here, it's now its own separate test case. Start off by entering the transaction code, and then within the main body of the test case, here's where we enter the details that are required for the outbound delivery. Again, some of these we can select from drop-downs because these are fairly standard references in here. The date, we've got some predefined dates there. One is today and one is predefined as plus 30 days, but we can go ahead and type whatever we like. And the order number there, we are saying to enter from the buffered order number from the previous test case. And again, we can now execute this one in the scratchbook. So from the menu screen here, we will enter the transaction code for the create delivery note. Provide the details from the test case, including the buffered order number, and that has completed successfully, and we got the green success message down the bottom left hand corner. And if we have a look in there again, we can see that verified successfully and has extracted the delivery number from the success message, and that has been stored away now as a new buffer that can be used later on in the process. So, okay, now I'm not going to enter every single transaction in this process, we don't have time for that, so I'll just round this out for now by logging out of the system itself. So we'll go away and find the log out library block. Confirm there's a few steps in there just to go through the process of exiting SAP, and again we will run that in our scratchbook. There's Tosca looking for a license, there we go, logging out, confirming it, and closing down the login screen. Back in Tosca, again, green ticks across the board, confirming that we were able to do everything we were asked to do. Even there we can see in the message itself, it's verifying that we've received that log off message. Okay, so now that we've completed that sequence of tests, reduced though it is, we're ready to add this to an execution list so we can execute that as an end-to-end. So I have an execution list already created, and I can just drag that whole folder of test cases onto my execution list. And you can see contained within there are references to those 4 test cases. Now the execution list, we'll run this through end to end now rather than as individual transactions, so we can see that flows through from transaction to transaction, starting with the login and then finishing off with the log out. Logging into SAP, entering our sales order transaction, entering the details and the material, saving that, we get the green message at the bottom, verified, and we'll extract the order number out of there. Back to the main menu, as we come back to the menu at the end of each transaction. And now we'll enter the create delivery note transaction, entered the buffered order number, save that again, extracted the details from there, and then exited out of SAP. There we go, so now in our execution list, and now this is where we keep the execution results long term, so we can see we have a time-stamped entry for this specific run. We can see the details of the data that was entered into the system showing up there in the value field. So if we're using dynamic data, we can see what was actually used at the point of execution. Verifications on these transactions as we go along, so we can see in there, this is where we verified the message, standard order has been saved, and extracted the actual order number out of there. And likewise under the delivery note, we can see the data that was used there, in this case here, so this is where we had dynamic data, so what we can do is add an extra column into our view here to show the used value. So this is the value that we actually input, or what that date function translated to at runtime, and what that buffer represented at runtime as well. So that completes our first approach, the process driven, where each transaction is our own test case. So now we'll move on to what I'm calling data driven, because it's the first step on the way to true data driven, where we actually have all of these transactions in a single test case. However, in this case, the transactions are actually parameterized, so we can supply the data in one location up front rather than into each individual step as we go along. And here we can see within the library block the parameters and where they then feed into the steps at the correct locations within the transaction. And the same goes for sales order. For each of the different transaction types, we've built this parameter layer that allows us to feed data into the relevant steps. Okay, so what we're going to do this time round, rather than just immediately dragging and dropping, is we actually manually create a test case first that we are then going to drop those reusable library blocks into. So start off with the giving the test case a name and finding the transactions we're after, as we did before. So and we'll start off with the login, and then we'll get our sales order, get our create delivery note, and then we will finish with the log off again. So the same sequence we went through before, but this time we'll see that this is all contained within a single test case. And when we expand these out, we just have these parameters that we need to fill in, and we don't see all the detail that sits behind each of these library steps. And we go through, same as we did before, we can set these up there so that we have the list of values available to us. Where it makes sense, obviously for materials and orders that it doesn't make sense having a defined list. So we go through, do that for entering the sales order, same details we used last time round, and the same for creating the delivery note. And again here we have pre-specified dates, either today or 30 days out, but we can enter any detail we like there, or any date that we like relative to today. And again, as we did before, we'll just drag that whole folder onto our SAP execution list, and we can run. This time there's only one test case in there, but as we did before, we can run this, and we'll see, we'll go through exactly the same process. So this will launch SAP, log into the specific instance we want, enter the transaction code for our sales order, enter the details, the salted party, materials, etc. Save that transaction, we'll get our green success message down the bottom, extract the order number out of there, and then we will enter the transaction code for creating our delivery note, entering the buffered order number from the previous step, and again verify our delivery note was created correctly and extract the delivery note number from there, and that it completes the execution. And again we can see in here in our execution list we now have a single entry there, time stamped for the time the execution ran, and each of the same steps that we ran through, although as I said this time all in one single test case. But again we can see all of the information that was entered into the system at runtime, including the verification messages and the transaction code, or the order number that was extracted out of the system and stored in the buffer to use in our create delivery step later on. So again here, where there's dynamic data, we can see the actual value that was used at runtime. So that's it for the second technique. That's using parameterized transactions all within a single test case. Okay, so now we'll move on to our third and final technique, which is true data driven using a template. So and a connected data source. So what we have here is a data sheet set up with, in this case, 3 different instances called test case 1 through to 3 for a flat screen, an electric motor, and an invalid material for the last one. So if we open up, expand the attributes in here, we can see here we're defining the inputs that we need for our various test cases, and the actual value that represents. So OR for the standard order, VA01 for our sales order, and if you look down at materials, we can see here we actually have some variation, whereas the others are the same across all 3. So we've got a flat screen, an electric motor, and an invalid material, and a little bit of variation in the order quantity as well between 1 and 5. And then here we can specify the verification message that we're expecting, so that the order has been saved successfully or that the material is not correct. Now we need to create the actual transaction template. So we won't reinvent the wheel. We'll make a copy of the test case that we put together previously, and we'll make that the starting point for our template. So in this case here, because we're going to have multiple entries and we don't want to log on and log off every time, so we'll remove those login and log outs for now, and we will enter them back in a little later on, before and after we've completed the whole sequence, all of the test cases. So we'll clear out those directly entered data values, and what we need to do here is convert our test case into a template, which means we can now link it to a data source by dragging and dropping the data source on top. You can see when we do that, we create a linkage between our input fields and the attributes within our data sheet. What we also want to do here, so that we know whether the test is successful or not, which verification message we're expecting to find, we're going to enter the test case character, or the test character, which is either valid or invalid or straight through, as defined by the symbol there. So the red I is straight through, the white I is valid, and the cross is invalid. So that will help determine our flow when we're verifying within our test cases. Now, having got our template and our linked data source, we're going to create our actual test cases. So we'll do that creating our template instances, and that will create a folder with the number of test cases equaling the number of data instances we defined in our sheet. Now we can see here that that linkage to the data has been replaced by the actual data from the sheet. So the material there, a bit different from the previous one, and the last one here, the material is actually an invalid, it's using XXX. Okay, so now we're ready to execute this. So as we did before, we can copy this whole folder into an execution list, or drag the whole folder into an execution list, should I say. But what we also want to do, because we have 3 test cases there, but these are actually assumed we've already logged into SAP. So what we need to do now is provide a single login prior to executing these test cases, and then a log out at the end of it. It's just a bit more efficient to do that once rather than every single test case logging in and logging out. So we put them in the correct order, log in our 3 test cases, then log out. And because this folder here is actually linked to our test case folder, we can just say synchronize, and it brings in the pointers to those login, log out steps. And as we did before, we can now execute our test case in the execution list rather than in Scratchbook. So here we get our login screen. Log into the ECC instance, entering our first transaction. Now this is the same, exactly the same transaction we've seen all along here. So it's the M09 material, flat screen TV, which we know is good. So we should get the green transaction, the green success message at the bottom. And again, we extract the and buffer the order number there so that we can use that in our next step. Entered the order number and a date 30 days out, and again that transaction is successful. And now we're moving on to our second test case. Now this time the material was M3000, I think from memory. Yep, there we go. And this time we get an error message saying that material is not valid for our order and party. So that gives a test message. So that is not what we expected. So what we will see in the execution log is what happens when we get an error in our execution. So obviously, because the order wasn't created, we also couldn't create the delivery for that. Okay, and now moving on to the third one. So here's where we had a material XXX. Obviously an invalid material, but this time in our test case we had specified it as an invalid test, and therefore we were verifying the fail message. So now we have a look at the execution log here. So obviously logged in successfully. Our first test case passed. That's the one we've run several times already today. So no real change there. So we can see the materials, the M009. Again, we add back in the used value, so we can see the values that were actually used at the point of execution. So the M009, and a value of 1, a quantity of 1. Now, this is an example of a failure. So we can see here, big red cross tells us something happened that wasn't as we expected to. So this is the one where we entered M3000, thinking this was a valid material. But what we can see when we went to verify the message saying standard order has been saved and extract the number, instead we got a message saying material M3000 is not defined. Okay, so we can go away and look at our setup to say, have we picked the wrong material, or is there something wrong in the setup there? Now in the third one here, we define it as being an invalid test from the first place, so we entered material XXX knowing that would be incorrect, and that correctly verified the error message was. So that completes my demonstration for today. I hope you found it useful, and if you want to talk to us further about automating SAP, please look us up. Thank you.